The firehouse buzzed with energy as usual, laughter bouncing off the walls, boots clanging against the concrete floor, and radios crackling with occasional calls. It seemed like an ordinary day, but beneath the surface of camaraderie and teamwork, something darker simmered. She walked in, confident, calm, and composed, her uniform neat, her head held high. She was the first black woman to join this station, a historic moment in its long-standing history. But instead of applause or support, she was met with cold stares and whispered comments. Her name was Amara. She had worked tirelessly to get here, overcoming obstacles that most couldn't imagine. Firefighting wasn't just a career for her, it was a calling. From a young age, she dreamed of saving lives, of making a difference, of showing young girls who looked like her that they could do anything. But dreams sometimes clash with reality. From the moment she stepped into the station, the subtle jabs started. Comments about how she wouldn't be able to handle the weight of the gear. Snide remarks about whether she'd ever seen fire up close. They tested her, not with respect but with ridicule, questioning her every move. It wasn't just her race. It wasn't just her gender. It was both, an intersection of prejudice that followed her every step. But Amara wasn't easily broken. For every sarcastic comment, she answered with strength. For every obstacle thrown her way, she worked twice as hard to overcome it. Her determination was unshakable, her spirit fierce. She reminded herself daily why she chose this path: to serve, to protect, to inspire. But even the strongest hearts can be worn down by cruelty. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Amara wasn't fighting this battle alone. She had someone in her corner, someone they would never suspect. Her son, Marcus, was her pride and joy. A quiet, observant teenager, Marcus had inherited his mother's resilience. He watched her come home after grueling shifts, sometimes with tears she wouldn't let him see, and vowed to stand by her in any way he could. But Marcus had a secret of his own, one that even Amara didn't fully understand. Marcus wasn't just any teenager. His intelligence was exceptional, his abilities extraordinary. He had a gift, one that would soon come to light in the most unexpected way. As the taunts at the firehouse escalated, as the so-called brotherhood showed its ugliest side, Marcus began piecing together a plan. He didn't want revenge, he wanted justice. And he knew exactly how to get it. The firefighters underestimated Amara. They underestimated her strength, her determination, and most of all, her family. They thought their behavior would break her, that their words and actions would force her to quit. They didn't realize they were pushing her towards something far greater. And when Marcus stepped into the picture, everything began to shift. The firehouse had no idea what was coming. As the days turned into weeks, the bullying reached a boiling point. But instead of breaking down, Amara and Marcus began to rise up. Together, they uncovered secrets, connected dots, and prepared for a moment that would leave everyone stunned. What did Marcus know? What had he discovered? And how would their story change not just the firehouse, but the community as a whole? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Amara's days at the station became harder with each passing shift. The pranks became meaner, the stares colder, and the silence around her louder. It wasn't just the offhand remarks anymore, it was the constant reminders that they didn't want her there. Someone, accidentally, spilled coffee on her gear. Another time, her locker was left open, her neatly folded uniform tossed onto the dirty floor. She told herself to push through, that every challenge would make her stronger, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the ache that came with being treated as an outsider. Still, Amara refused to let them see her sweat. She woke up every morning before the sun, went for a run, and reminded herself why she started this journey. She had spent years training, studying, and proving herself worthy of the job. Every call she answered was a chance to make a difference, and that thought alone kept her going. But there were moments, quiet, fragile moments, when she questioned if she could keep going. Sitting in her car outside the fire station one evening, she stared at the steering wheel, her hands trembling. She thought of her son, Marcus, waiting for her at home, always asking how her day went with those big, curious eyes. She thought about how proud he was when she first told him she'd made it. "Mom, you're a superhero," he had said. Those words were her anchor. No matter what they threw at her, she couldn't let him down. Meanwhile, Marcus had noticed something was off. Amara tried to shield him from the worst of it, but he wasn't a little kid anymore. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she told him everything was fine. Marcus wasn't the type to ask too many questions, but he was always watching, always thinking. One evening, while Amara was washing dishes after dinner, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, pretending to do his homework. In reality, he was replaying the few things she'd let slip about work, the way her tone changed when she mentioned her coworkers, the stories she avoided telling. Marcus wasn't just intelligent, he was deeply empathetic. He didn't need her to spell it out to know she was being treated unfairly. "Mom," he finally said, breaking the silence, "do you ever get tired of proving people wrong?" Amara paused, the water running over her hands as she stared out the kitchen window. She turned to look at him, her eyes soft but steady. "All the time," she admitted. "But it's not about them, Marcus. It's about us. It's about showing you, showing the world, that no one gets to tell us what we're worth." Her words stuck with him. That night, as he lay in bed, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about everything his mom had gone through. He knew he couldn't fight her battles for her, but he also knew he had a role to play. What Amara didn't know was that Marcus had a knack for uncovering things others overlooked. He loved puzzles, challenges that required patience and focus. And while his teachers thought his brilliance was confined to the classroom, Marcus had a secret hobby: he was a tech wizard. He had taught himself coding and digital forensics, spending countless hours watching tutorials and tinkering with software. One night, when Amara was working a late shift, Marcus sat at his desk with a determined look in his eyes. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he felt certain the firehouse wasn't as pristine as it appeared on the outside. If they treated his mom this way, who was to say there wasn't more beneath the surface? He started small, searching public records about the station and its staff. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon news articles and reports that hinted at a pattern. There had been previous complaints, allegations of misconduct, whispers of a toxic culture, but nothing ever seemed to stick. The cases were dismissed, swept under the rug. Marcus's curiosity deepened. He began piecing together timelines, connecting dots that painted a troubling picture. He found old social media posts, anonymous reviews, and even public forums where former firefighters hinted at the same issues his mom was facing. The more he uncovered, the angrier he became. How could a place meant to serve the community, to save lives, harbor such a toxic undercurrent? But Marcus wasn't just angry, he was strategic. He knew that if he wanted to help his mom, he couldn't act impulsively. He needed proof, something undeniable that would expose the truth. And so, he kept digging, his computer screen glowing late into the night as he followed every lead he could find. Back at the station, Amara was beginning to notice subtle changes. Not everyone was against her. There were a few colleagues who seemed to sympathize, even if they didn't openly defend her. One of them, a younger firefighter named Liam, occasionally offered her quiet words of encouragement. "You're tougher than all of them combined," he told her once, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. But Amara knew Liam was scared. Speaking up would make him a target too, and she couldn't blame him for staying quiet. Still, his small gestures reminded her that not everyone in the firehouse had written her off. The tension reached a new high when Amara was assigned to lead a training drill. It was a standard exercise, one she had practiced countless times before, but the way her coworkers looked at her made it clear they didn't plan to make it easy. Throughout the drill, they found ways to undermine her, ignoring her instructions, questioning her decisions, and, at one point, deliberately messing with the equipment. Amara kept her composure, refusing to let them see how much it got to her. But when the drill ended, and she overheard a group of them laughing about her performance, she felt a familiar sting in her chest. That night, when she got home, Marcus noticed the way she sighed as she took off her boots, the heaviness in her steps. He didn't say anything right away, but his resolve grew stronger. What Marcus didn't know was that Amara had been documenting everything. Every comment, every action, every incident. She had been keeping a record, just in case. It wasn't in her nature to fight back with the same hostility they showed her, but she believed in accountability. Little did they know, mother and son were working toward the same goal in their own ways. The question wasn't if the truth would come out. It was when and how. The tone further. Amara woke up the next morning with a sense of determination. Despite everything, she wasn't going to back down. She had spent too many years fighting to get to this position, and she wasn't about to let them chase her away. She reminded herself of her purpose: to serve her community, to prove that she belonged in a space they tried to deny her, and to pave the way for those who would come after her. At the firehouse, the air felt heavier than usual. The tension was palpable, and Amara could sense that something was brewing. A group of her coworkers huddled in the corner, their hushed voices occasionally breaking into laughter. She caught snippets of their conversation, but they were careful to lower their voices whenever she passed by. She had learned not to engage, knowing it would only add fuel to their fire. Instead, she focused on her tasks, determined to let her work speak for itself. But as the day unfolded, the hostility became harder to ignore. During a routine inspection, someone had deliberately swapped out her equipment, replacing it with faulty gear. Amara discovered it just in time, but the realization sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just about jokes or words anymore, this was dangerous. It was a line that should never have been crossed. Amara reported the incident to the captain, but his response was disappointingly predictable. He dismissed it as a misunderstanding, suggesting that she was overreacting. "You need to toughen up," he said with a shrug. "This is just how things are around here." His words echoed in her mind as she drove home that evening. She felt a mix of anger and despair, but also a renewed sense of purpose. If no one else was going to hold them accountable, she would have to find a way to do it herself. Meanwhile, Marcus was making progress of his own. He had uncovered more information about the firehouse, including records that hinted at systemic issues. He found details about past incidents that had been quietly swept under the rug, cases of harassment, safety violations, and even misuse of resources. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about his mom. The culture at the firehouse was deeply flawed, and it had been allowed to fester for years. One night, as Marcus was piecing together his findings, he stumbled upon something unexpected. An anonymous whistleblower had posted online about a similar experience at a nearby firehouse. The details were eerily familiar, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was a larger pattern at play. He reached out to the person, carefully crafting a message that explained his mom's situation without revealing too much. To his surprise, the whistleblower responded almost immediately. They told him about their own experience, how they had tried to speak out, only to face retaliation and isolation. They warned Marcus to be careful, but they also offered advice on how to gather evidence and build a case. Their words were a lifeline, giving Marcus the guidance he needed to take his efforts to the next level. Amara, unaware of Marcus's late-night investigations, continued to document everything that happened at the firehouse. She kept a journal detailing every comment, every prank, every act of sabotage. She also began to notice patterns, certain individuals who seemed to be the ringleaders, and others who followed their lead out of fear or complacency. One of those followers was Liam. He had always been kind to Amara, but he never spoke up when it mattered most. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a training exercise, Amara confronted him. "Why don't you say something?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "You know what they're doing is wrong." Liam hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I do," he admitted quietly. "But if I speak up, they'll turn on me too. I've seen it happen before." Amara nodded, understanding his fear even though it frustrated her. "You don't have to fight my battles," she said. "But staying silent makes you part of the problem." Her words stayed with Liam long after she walked away. He couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him, and for the first time, he began to question his own role in the firehouse's toxic culture. Back at home, Marcus was working on a plan. He had gathered enough evidence to expose the firehouse's behavior, but he wanted to make sure it would have an impact. He reached out to a local journalist who had covered similar stories in the past, carefully explaining the situation and sharing some of the information he had uncovered. The journalist, intrigued by the story, agreed to look into it further. But Marcus wasn't stopping there. He also began to create a presentation, compiling the evidence in a way that was clear and compelling. His goal wasn't just to expose the truth but to make sure it couldn't be ignored. Amara began to notice subtle changes at the firehouse. Liam started to distance himself from the group, spending more time working alongside her. A few others began to follow suit, their behavior shifting as they saw her resilience and determination. But the ringleaders remained as cruel as ever, doubling down on their efforts to push her out. One day, during a particularly tense shift, Amara received an anonymous note in her locker. It was a simple message, written in shaky handwriting. "Keep going. You're not alone." She didn't know who had left it, but it gave her a renewed sense of hope. The tension at the firehouse reached a boiling point when a high-stakes emergency call came in. A fire had broken out at a local apartment complex, and the team was dispatched to respond. It was a chaotic scene, with flames engulfing the building and residents scrambling to evacuate. Amara threw herself into the work, her focus razor-sharp as she helped guide people to safety. For a brief moment, the hostility at the firehouse seemed to disappear as everyone worked together toward a common goal. But even in the chaos, there were cracks in the facade. One of the ringleaders, a firefighter named Jeff, deliberately ignored Amara's instructions during the rescue effort, putting both her and a civilian at risk. Amara's quick thinking prevented a disaster, but it was a stark reminder that their animosity wasn't confined to the walls of the firehouse. It could have real, dangerous consequences. When the fire was finally under control, Amara confronted Jeff in front of the team. "You put lives at risk today," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about the people we're supposed to protect." Jeff sneered, but for the first time, some of the other firefighters looked uncomfortable. The cracks in their unity were starting to show. As Amara drove home that night, exhausted but resolute, Marcus was waiting for her with news. He had finalized his presentation and secured a meeting with the journalist. "Mom," he said, his eyes filled with determination, "it's time to tell the world what's really happening." The pieces were falling into place, but the battle was far from over. The firehouse was quieter than usual in the days following the apartment fire. The team moved through their shifts with a strained tension, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Amara noticed the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped the moment she walked into a room. Something was shifting, and while she couldn't quite put her finger on it, she felt it deep in her gut. At home, Marcus was laser-focused. He and the journalist had agreed to meet in person later that week, and Marcus spent every spare moment fine-tuning his presentation. He wanted every piece of evidence to be irrefutable, every connection undeniable. His mom deserved better, and he was determined to make sure her story wasn't just heard but believed. Amara, unaware of Marcus's plans, continued to face her battles at the firehouse. The pranks and sabotage had quieted down, but the hostility remained. She knew that the ringleaders weren't finished, and the uneasy silence felt almost more dangerous than their open aggression. It was the calm before the storm, and she braced herself for whatever was coming next. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Amara sat alone in the firehouse kitchen, staring into a cup of cold coffee. She thought about everything she had endured to get to this point: the training, the late nights, the sacrifices. She thought about the faces of the people she had helped, the lives she had saved. Those moments, fleeting as they were, made it all worth it. Liam walked in, hesitating when he saw her. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around and leave, but then he sighed and sat down across from her. "Amara," he said quietly, his voice laced with guilt, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her expression wary but curious. "They're planning something," he continued, glancing nervously toward the door. "I don't know all the details, but Jeff and the others, they're not letting this go. They're angry about what happened at the fire. They think you made them look bad." Amara felt a knot form in her stomach. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. "What are they planning?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping in. Liam shook his head. "I don't know exactly. Just, be careful." She nodded, appreciating his warning even as frustration bubbled inside her. She couldn't fight shadows. Whatever they were planning, she would have to be ready for it, even if she didn't know what it was. That night, as she drove home, she thought about the countless times she had been warned to watch her back. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her feel unwelcome in a space she had every right to be in. But this time, it wasn't just about her. She thought about Marcus, about the example she was setting for him. She wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. Meanwhile, Marcus was putting the finishing touches on his presentation. He had organized the evidence into a clear, chronological timeline, weaving together the patterns of misconduct, negligence, and outright harassment. He had even included a section highlighting his mom's achievements, showing how much she had accomplished despite the obstacles in her path. The meeting with the journalist was set for the next day, and Marcus could hardly contain his nerves. He hadn't told his mom what he was doing, partly because he wanted it to be a surprise, but also because he didn't want to worry her. She already had enough on her plate. The next morning, Amara arrived at the firehouse to find her locker vandalized. Spray painted across the door in bold red letters was a single word: quit. She stared at it for a moment, her jaw tightening. It wasn't the first time she had been targeted, but something about this felt different. This was more blatant, more personal. She reported the incident to the captain, who gave her the same dismissive response he always did. "I'll look into it," he said, though they both knew he wouldn't. Amara didn't let it shake her. Instead, she used it as fuel. Every act of hostility only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't going to let them win. That afternoon, during a team meeting, the tension finally boiled over. Jeff made a snide comment about Amara's performance at the apartment fire, and she decided she had had enough. "Do you have a problem with me, Jeff?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward them. Jeff smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You said it, not me." Amara didn't flinch. "No, I'm saying it now. If you have something to say it to my face." Jeff's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're just a distraction. We don't need you." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Amara felt the familiar sting of anger and hurt, but she refused to let it show. "You're wrong," she said simply. "And one day, you're going to realize that." The meeting ended in uncomfortable silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Amara knew she had made herself an even bigger target, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to let them silence her. That evening, Marcus met with the journalist at a local cafe. He brought his laptop, his notes carefully organized, and his heart pounding in his chest. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, listened intently as Marcus laid out his findings. "This isn't just about my mom," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's about everyone who's been pushed out, ignored, or mistreated. It's about the people they're supposed to protect." Sarah nodded, clearly impressed by his dedication. "This is big," she said. "But you have to be ready for pushback. Stories like this don't go down quietly." Marcus nodded. "I just want the truth to come out." As he walked home that night, he felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had taken the first step, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. Back at the firehouse, Amara stayed late, finishing up paperwork in the quiet of the empty building. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, but she didn't know what. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her, but she refused to let it crush her. As she locked up and walked to her car, she didn't notice the shadowy figure watching her from across the parking lot. Amara drove home that night, exhausted but resolute. The vandalized locker, the meeting with Jeff, and the unshakable feeling of being watched had left her mentally drained. But she couldn't let fear consume her. She reminded herself of why she was here: to serve her community, to show strength for Marcus, and to prove to herself that she was capable of overcoming anything. Still, as she parked in her driveway and glanced at the empty street behind her, she couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Marcus was waiting for her in the kitchen when she walked in, his laptop still open on the table and a look of quiet determination on his face. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." Amara raised an eyebrow, setting her bag down on the counter. "What's going on?" Marcus hesitated, then motioned for her to sit down. "I've been working on something," he began, his voice measured but earnest. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure it could help, but I've been looking into what's been happening at the firehouse. I've been gathering evidence, everything from the harassment to their safety violations. And I've been in contact with someone who can make sure the truth gets out." Amara stared at him, her emotions a swirl of surprise, pride, and unease. "Marcus, you've been doing this behind my back?" "I wasn't trying to hide it from you," he said quickly. "I just didn't want to overwhelm you with everything you're already dealing with." "But, Mom, this is important. People need to know what's going on. You shouldn't have to fight this alone." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't just about me. It's about the entire firehouse. If this goes public, the backlash could be huge, for everyone involved." "That's the point," Marcus said, his voice firm. "They need to be held accountable. If no one says anything, nothing will ever change." Amara looked at her son, seeing the fire in his eyes. He reminded her so much of herself, determined, resourceful, unwilling to back down. She couldn't fault him for wanting to help, even if his methods made her nervous. "Okay," she said finally. "Tell me everything." Marcus spent the next hour walking her through the evidence he had gathered. He showed her the timeline he had created, the whistleblower's testimony, and the journalist's preliminary research into similar incidents at other firehouses. Amara listened intently, her initial apprehension giving way to a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe this could work. But just as they were beginning to feel a sense of progress, Amara's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and frowned when she saw an unfamiliar number. Answering cautiously, she said, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and tense. "Amara, it's Liam. You need to be careful. I overheard Jeff and the others talking. They're planning something big, something to push you out for good. I don't know what, but it's happening soon." Amara's heart sank. "Did they say anything specific?" "No," Liam admitted, "but they seemed serious. You should watch your back." Amara thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. She glanced at Marcus, who was watching her with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Liam says they're planning something," she said. "He doesn't know what, but it's serious." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we need to act fast. The journalist is ready to move forward, but if they're planning something dangerous, we can't wait for the story to break." Amara nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll handle things at the firehouse. You focus on getting the story out. If they're going to come after me, I want the world to know the truth first." The next morning, Amara arrived at the firehouse early, determined to stay one step ahead of whatever Jeff and his crew were planning. She kept her head down and focused on her work, all the while keeping a careful eye on her surroundings. She noticed the glances, the smirks, the way they clustered together in hushed conversations. They thought they had the upper hand, but Amara wasn't about to let them win. Later that day, the team was called out to another emergency, a fire at an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town. The situation was chaotic, with thick black smoke billowing into the sky and the acrid smell of burning chemicals filling the air. Amara's instincts kicked in, and she threw herself into the work, directing civilians to safety and coordinating with her team. But as the operation unfolded, she realized something was wrong. Jeff and another firefighter, Brian, were deliberately ignoring her orders, splitting off from the group and putting themselves, and others, in unnecessary danger. Amara tried to call them back, but they refused to respond, their actions reckless and defiant. At one point, Jeff motioned for Amara to follow him deeper into the building, claiming there were still people trapped inside. Amara hesitated, the alarm bells in her head ringing louder than ever. But she couldn't ignore the possibility that someone's life was at stake. Against her better judgment, she followed him. The smoke grew thicker as they moved further in, the heat intensifying with every step. Amara could barely see, her breathing labored as she tried to keep up with Jeff. Suddenly, he stopped and turned to face her, his expression cold and calculating. "There's no one here," he said, his voice muffled by his mask. Amara froze, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" "This is where you don't belong, Amara," he said. "And this is where it ends." Before she could react, Jeff disappeared into the smoke, leaving her alone in the suffocating heat. Amara's mind raced as she realized the trap she had walked into. But Amara wasn't about to give up. She had faced worse odds before, and she wasn't going to let Jeff or anyone else dictate her fate. Taking a deep breath, she turned and began to make her way back through the maze of flames and smoke, relying on her training and instincts to guide her. At the same time, Marcus was at home, unaware of the danger his mom was in. He was on the phone with Sarah, finalizing the details for the story's release. As they spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a nagging sense of unease that refused to go away. And then, as he hung up the phone, his worst fears were confirmed. His mom's name flashed across the screen in an emergency alert, followed by the words, "Firefighter trapped in burning building." Amara stumbled through the thick smoke, her heart racing and lungs straining as the heat pressed against her from all sides. Every step was a battle to keep going, to fight back the panic clawing at her chest. She knew she couldn't afford to lose focus, not here, not now. She retraced her path in her mind, trying to remember the way out of the building, but the smoke was disorienting, and the roar of the fire made it nearly impossible to think clearly. Her radio crackled faintly, Jeff's voice cutting through the static. "Hope you're enjoying your last day on the job," he said, his tone dripping with malice. Amara gritted her teeth, anger flaring inside her. She refused to let him win. She refused to let this be the end. "Mayday, Mayday," she called into her radio, her voice hoarse but steady. "This is Firefighter Johnson. I'm trapped inside the warehouse and need assistance." She gave her approximate location, praying that someone would hear her and act. Outside, the scene was chaos. Fire engines were parked in a row, firefighters scrambling to contain the blaze. Marcus had arrived after seeing the emergency alert, his heart pounding as he searched for any sign of his mom. When he spotted her captain, he ran up to him, desperation written all over his face. "My mom's in there," he shouted. "Why isn't anyone going in to help her?" The captain hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We're doing everything we can, but the situation is dangerous. We can't risk sending anyone in right now." Marcus's frustration boiled over. "You're just going to leave her in there? She's one of your own." Before the captain could respond, another firefighter stepped forward. It was Liam. "I'll go," he said firmly, already strapping on his gear. "I'm not leaving her behind." Without waiting for approval, Liam pushed past the others and disappeared into the building. Marcus watched him go, a mix of hope and fear churning inside him. Inside the warehouse, Amara was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. Her oxygen tank was running low, and the fire showed no signs of slowing down. Just when she thought she might not make it out, she heard a voice calling her name. "Amara, where are you?" It was Liam. Relief washed over her as she shouted back, "I'm here." She could barely see him through the smoke, but his flashlight cut through the darkness like a beacon. Moments later, he was at her side, helping her to her feet. "We need to move," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay close to me." Together, they navigated the treacherous path back toward the exit. The heat was unbearable, the flames licking at their heels, but they pushed forward, their determination stronger than the fire surrounding them. As they neared the exit, a loud creak echoed through the building, followed by the sound of metal twisting and groaning. Amara looked up just in time to see a section of the ceiling start to collapse. She shoved Liam out of the way, the debris crashing down behind her and cutting off their path. "Go," she shouted. "You can still make it. I'm not leaving without you." Liam yelled back. He frantically looked for another way out, his eyes landing on a narrow corridor to their left. "This way." The two of them made a break for it, the flames closing in around them. Just when it seemed like there was no escape, they burst through a side door and stumbled into the fresh air. A cheer erupted from the crowd of firefighters and onlookers as they emerged, battered but alive. Marcus ran to his mom, throwing his arms around her as tears streamed down his face. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice shaking. Amara hugged him tightly, her own tears spilling over. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." But the moment of relief was short-lived. As Amara looked around, she saw Jeff standing off to the side, his expression a mix of shock and anger. He hadn't expected her to make it out alive, and now he knew his plan had failed. Liam stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "Jeff, I heard what you said over the radio. You left her in there on purpose. You wanted her to die." The crowd turned to Jeff, their faces a mix of disbelief and outrage. Jeff tried to deny it, but the evidence was mounting. Other firefighters came forward, sharing what they had overheard or witnessed. Marcus, still holding his mom's hand, stepped up. "This is who you're protecting?" he asked, his voice filled with righteous anger. "A man who would rather let someone die than admit he's wrong." The captain, clearly shaken, announced that there would be a full investigation. Jeff was escorted away, his protests falling on deaf ears. As the chaos died down, Amara looked at Marcus and smiled. "You did it," she said. "You helped make this happen." Marcus shook his head. "We did it, Mom. Together." But just as they were beginning to feel a sense of closure, Liam approached them, his expression serious. "There's something else you need to know," he said. Jeff wasn't acting alone. There are others in the department who were helping him, covering for him. "This isn't over." Amara's smile faded, replaced by a steely resolve. "Then we'll keep fighting," she said. "We're not done yet." And with that, the story took another turn, leaving everyone wondering what would come next. The battle wasn't over, but Amara and Marcus were ready for whatever lay ahead. The days following the warehouse fire were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Amara, still recovering from the ordeal, spent time reflecting on everything that had happened. She was grateful to be alive and deeply moved by the support she received from Marcus, Liam, and even some of her co-workers who had once stayed silent. The truth was finally coming to light, and while it wasn't an easy path, Amara knew it was the right one. Marcus was relentless in his mission to hold the department accountable. With the journalists' help, the story was published, detailing not only the harassment Amara endured but also the dangerous culture of complacency and cover-ups within the firehouse. The article spread quickly, igniting conversations across the city about systemic issues in public service institutions. People were shocked and outraged, and the demand for change grew louder with each passing day. Amara was called to testify during the investigation. She recounted everything she had experienced, from the graffiti on her locker to the life-threatening sabotage at the warehouse. Her voice was steady, her resolve unwavering, as she described the toxic environment she had been subjected to. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about preventing anyone else from going through the same thing. Jeff and his accomplices were suspended pending further action, and the investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct that went back years. Several senior officers were implicated, and the department faced widespread scrutiny. It wasn't just a matter of punishing individuals, it became clear that the entire system needed to be rebuilt. Through it all, Marcus stood by his mom's side, his unwavering support giving her strength. The bond between them grew even stronger, and Amara couldn't have been prouder of the young man he had become. Marcus had not only been her advocate but also her partner in the fight for justice. His determination reminded her that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the months went by, the firehouse underwent significant changes. New leadership was brought in, and mandatory training on diversity, inclusion, and ethics was implemented. Amara's presence became a symbol of resilience, and her colleagues began to see her not as an outsider but as a leader who had earned her place. The culture shift wasn't immediate, and there were still challenges, but progress was being made. One afternoon, as Amara was organizing equipment in the station, Liam approached her with a smile. "You're still here," he said, leaning against the doorway. She chuckled. "Of course I am. This is my job, my passion. I'm not going anywhere." Liam nodded, his expression serious. "You've made a real difference, you know. Not just here, but for people everywhere. Your stories inspired so many." Amara felt a lump in her throat but managed to smile. "I didn't do it alone. I had help, from you, from Marcus, from everyone who stood up for what was right." As she looked around the firehouse, she realized how far they had come. The walls that once felt hostile now felt like a place where she belonged. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was better. And that was something to be proud of. Back at home, Marcus was busy preparing for a presentation at his college. He had been invited to speak about his experience supporting his mom and the importance of standing up for what's right. Amara watched him rehearse, her heart swelling with pride. "You're going to do great," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Marcus smiled. "I learned from the best." That evening, they sat together on the couch, watching the sunset through the living room window. It was a rare moment of peace after months of chaos. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Regret what?" Amara replied, turning to him. "Fighting back, speaking out, everything we went through." Amara shook her head. "Not for a second. It was hard, and it hurt, but it was worth it. If we don't stand up for ourselves, who will? And if we don't fight for change, who will?" Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we didn't let them win." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, life began to settle into a new normal. Amara continued her work as a firefighter, more determined than ever to make a difference in her community. Marcus pursued his studies with renewed passion, inspired by the lessons he had learned from their journey. The firehouse, once a symbol of pain and adversity, became a place of growth and possibility. New recruits joined, bringing fresh perspectives and a willingness to embrace change. Amara mentored them, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to be better, to do better. One day, as she was preparing for a community outreach event, Amara received a letter in the mail. It was from a young woman who had read about her story and decided to pursue a career as a firefighter. "Your courage gave me the strength to follow my dreams," the letter read. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to overcome anything." Amara felt tears well up in her eyes as she folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. It was a reminder that every battle they had fought, every hardship they had endured, had been worth it. As she stood in front of the station that day, watching the crowd gather for the event, Amara felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life wasn't perfect, and the fight for justice was far from over, but they had made a difference. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The past had shaped them, but it didn't define them. They were stronger, braver, and more united than ever. And as Amara looked toward the future, she knew one thing for certain. They would face whatever came next together.